She took a bullet for a man she didn't even know, and that mistake was about to change her entire life. The first thing I remember is the weight of her in my arms, lighter than I expected, like the world had suddenly decided she mattered less than gravity, and I refused to accept that. My hands were steady, but everything else wasn't. The noise around us blurred into something distant, like a television left on in another room. People were talking, moving, reacting, but none of it touched me. All I could see was her face, pale under the restaurant lights, her expression frozen somewhere between surprise and quiet determination, as if she hadn't even had time to understand what she'd just done. 30 minutes earlier, she had been just another waitress working a late shift in a downtown Chicago restaurant, the kind of place where the coffee is always fresh and the tips depend on how well you can smile through a long night. Ava Brooks. That was the name on her tag. I noticed it when she first came to the table, her voice calm, her movements efficient, nothing remarkable on the surface, yet there was something about the way she carried herself, like she had already lived through enough to know how to keep going without asking for anything in return. She refilled my glass without interrupting my silence, didn't try to start a conversation, didn't look at me like she needed anything from me. That alone made her different. Most people either try too hard or not at all. She did neither. She simply existed in the moment, steady, grounded. I remember thinking that she was the kind of person the world overlooks, the kind that keeps everything running while everyone else takes the credit. And then everything shifted. It wasn't loud at first. Just a ripple in the air, the kind your instincts pick up before your mind does. I've lived long enough to recognize that feeling, the subtle change that means something is about to go wrong. My body reacted before I moved, tension settling into my shoulders, my focus narrowing. I didn't stand. I didn't reach for anything. I stayed still, because stillness is control. But she moved. Not fast, not dramatic, just one decisive step that placed her directly between me and something she didn't understand. That was the moment everything broke. She didn't hesitate. Didn't look back. Didn't ask why. She made a choice in less than a second, the kind of choice most people spend a lifetime avoiding. And now she was in my arms, paying the price for it. I looked down at her again, my expression calm, my breathing even, but something unfamiliar pressed against the edges of my control. No one does that. No one risks everything for a stranger. Not in my world. Not in any world I've ever known. And yet she did. I tightened my hold just slightly, enough to remind myself she was still here, still breathing, still within reach. Around us, things were already changing. I could feel it without looking. The shift in energy, the silent signals passing between people who understood exactly what this moment meant. They would handle everything else. They always did. But this was mine. I lowered my voice, quiet enough that only she could hear it, even if she wasn't fully aware. You should have walked away, I said, not as a warning, not as a judgment, but as a fact. Because if she had, her life would still belong to her. Now, that was no longer certain. The ambulance doors closed with a dull, final sound that cut through everything else, and for the first time in years, I felt something I did not recognize immediately, not fear, not anger, but a disruption, like a system I had spent a lifetime perfecting had just encountered an error it could not process, and as the vehicle pulled away, I did not follow right away, because I already knew they would take her to the nearest trauma center within a 5-mile radius, and I knew every hospital in this city better than most people knew their own neighborhoods, so instead I stood there for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the world around me to catch up, long enough for the shift to complete, because moments like this do not stay contained, they expand, they ripple, they trigger things that cannot be undone, and right on time, I heard it, the subtle change in footsteps behind me, controlled, synchronized, disciplined, not rushed. Never rushed, my people did not run, they arrived, and when I turned, there were already 4 of them positioned without drawing attention, dressed like any other professionals finishing a late dinner, but their eyes were not on the room, they were on me, waiting, always waiting for direction, and one of them stepped closer, just enough to speak without being heard, his voice low, precise, "Sir, the perimeter is secure," and I gave a small nod, nothing more. Because words were unnecessary, they already knew what mattered, and none of it was the restaurant anymore, none of it was the people still whispering, still trying to understand what they had just witnessed, because that moment had already moved beyond them. It belonged to something else now, something larger, something that did not forgive mistakes, and yet, somehow, the only thing I could see was her, the way she had stepped forward without calculation, without hesitation. Like instinct had overridden logic, and that was not something I could ignore, not something I would allow to be reduced to chance. "Get the car," I said quietly, and that was enough. Doors opened, paths cleared, decisions executed before most people would even process the situation, and within minutes, I was seated in the back of a black sedan, the city lights sliding across the window in long, distorted lines, but I was not watching the city, I was replaying the moment, again and again, analyzing it, breaking it down, searching for the variable that did not belong, because people do not do what she did, not without reason, not without connection, and yet there was none, no history, no leverage, no gain, just a choice, pure and immediate, and that made it dangerous in a way most people would never understand, because unpredictability is the one thing you cannot control, and control is everything. The car slowed as we approached the hospital, already cleared before we arrived. Because that is how this works, doors open before you reach them, problems disappear before they can exist, and when I stepped inside, the air felt different, not because of the place, but because of what it had become, a space that now operated under a new set of rules, my rules, and the staff knew it even if they could not explain why. You can see it in the way people move, the way voices lower, the way decisions become sharper, faster, more careful, and a doctor approached, trying to maintain composure, trying to read me at the same time, which was a mistake, because there is nothing to read unless I want it seen. "She is being treated," he said, carefully choosing each word, and I held his gaze for a moment, just long enough to make the next part clear without raising my voice, without changing my tone. "She does not get lost in the system," I said, calm, steady, absolute, and something in his expression shifted immediately, understanding, not of who I was, but of what this meant, and that was enough, because identity is irrelevant when presence alone changes outcomes, and as he nodded and moved quickly to ensure it, I finally allowed myself one more thought, quiet, controlled, but undeniable. She stepped into my world without knowing it, and now there was no way out. Hospitals have a rhythm if you pay attention, a pattern of movement and sound that most people never notice, but I do, because control begins with observation, and the moment I stepped deeper into that building, I could feel the shift tighten, like every second was being measured against something invisible, something that now revolved around her. Ava Brooks. A name I had already committed to memory with a precision I usually reserved for far more strategic details, and yet there it was, repeating quietly in my mind as if it belonged there, as if it had always been there, which made no sense, and I do not tolerate things that do not make sense, so I moved forward, each step deliberate, each breath steady, until I reached the corridor where they had taken her. The doors closed, the lights above them steady, indifferent, like nothing inside mattered more than anything else in the world, but that was no longer true. Not tonight, not anymore, and I stopped just short of the line. Most people would not cross, not because I could not, but because I did not need to. My presence had already done what force would have done in seconds, and I could hear it, the change in tone behind those doors. Voices sharper, more focused, movements more urgent but controlled, because people respond to pressure whether they understand its source or not, and I let that silence stretch for a moment, long enough to feel the weight of what had happened settle into something real, something permanent, because this was no longer an event, it was a turning point, and turning points demand decisions, not reactions, and I do not react, I decide. Footsteps approached from behind again, different this time, heavier with information, and I did not turn until the man spoke. "We have identified the origin of the incident," he said, careful, respectful, and I nodded once, because of course they had. There are no unknowns that stay unknown for long, not in my world, but I did not ask for details, not yet, because timing matters, and right now there was only one priority. I looked back at the closed doors, my voice low, even. "Later," I said, and he understood immediately, stepping back without another word, because that is how this works. The hierarchy is clear, the sequence is precise, and nothing moves out of order unless I say it does. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe 20. Time has a way of stretching when you are waiting for something that should not matter as much as it suddenly does, and I found myself replaying the smallest details, the way she had looked at me before she moved, not afraid, not confused, just certain. And that certainty did not belong in a place like that, not directed at someone like me, which made it more dangerous than anything else that had happened tonight, because it meant she acted without calculation, and people who act without calculation cannot be predicted, and people who cannot be predicted cannot be ignored. The doors finally opened, and the doctor stepped out again, his posture straighter now, his voice steadier, but still carrying the weight of the moment. "She is stable," he said, and for a fraction of a second, something inside me loosened, not enough to show, not enough to change anything on the surface, but enough to register, and that was more than I was used to allowing. I held his gaze, just long enough to confirm there was nothing unsaid, and then I gave a slight nod. "Good," I replied, simple, controlled, final, because outcomes matter, not explanations, and as he moved away to continue whatever process came next, I remained exactly where I was, looking at the door that separated her world from mine, knowing that line no longer existed in the way it had before, because she had crossed it without permission, without understanding. And now I was the one deciding what that meant, and one thing was already clear: whatever life she had before tonight, whatever path she thought she was on, it had already changed, and she just did not know it yet. There is a moment after control is established when everything appears calm on the surface, but underneath, every piece is already moving into position, and that is where I operate best, in the space between what people see and what is actually happening, because while the hospital settled into its new rhythm around her, my world did not slow down, it accelerated, quiet, precise, efficient, like a machine that had just been given a new objective, and I stepped away from the corridor only when I knew there was nothing more to gain from standing there, because waiting without purpose is weakness, and I do not waste time on weakness. The hallway behind me faded into the background as I moved into a private room that had already been secured without anyone needing to ask. A table, a chair, clean lines, no distractions, exactly how I prefer it, and within seconds, the door closed, sealing off the noise of the outside world, leaving only clarity, and that is when the information began to arrive, not all at once, never chaotic, always structured, one detail at a time, layered, verified, complete. The man across from me did not sit until I gave the smallest indication, and when he spoke, it was direct. "The individuals involved have been identified," he said, and I listened without interrupting, because interruption is for people who do not understand the value of timing. Names, locations, affiliations, each piece placed carefully into a framework that was already forming in my mind, and none of it surprised me, because there are always patterns, always motives, always someone who believes they can act without consequence, and they are always wrong. The only question is how long it takes for that realization to reach them. I rested my hands lightly on the table, fingers still, expression unchanged, but my focus sharpened with each word, not on anger, not on emotion, but on resolution, because emotion clouds judgment, and judgment is everything, and the source. I asked finally, my voice level, controlled, and the answer came without hesitation, confirming what I had already suspected: a calculated move, not random, not accidental, and that made it simpler, because clarity removes complexity, and complexity is where mistakes live. I nodded once, slow, deliberate, and for a moment, the room went completely silent, the kind of silence that signals a decision has already been made, even before it is spoken, and when I finally did speak, it was quiet. Almost casual, but absolute. "Handle it," I said. And that was enough, no elaboration, no explanation, because none was needed. The structure already existed, the outcome already defined, and the man across from me understood exactly what that meant, standing immediately, leaving without another word, because once an order is given, conversation becomes unnecessary, and as the door closed again, I leaned back slightly, allowing a single breath to pass before my attention shifted back to the one variable that did not fit into any of this: Ava Brooks, a waitress who should have remained invisible, who should have walked away, who should have lived a life that never intersected with mine, and yet she did not, and now she was at the center of something she could not possibly understand, and that changed the equation in a way I could not ignore, because this was no longer just about correcting a mistake. It was about redefining the outcome, and I do not leave outcomes unfinished. I stood. Adjusted my jacket, every movement controlled, every thought aligned, and as I stepped back into the corridor, the air felt different again, quieter, sharper, like the world had already begun to adapt to what was coming next, and as I approached the door where she lay, one thing was already certain: whatever happens from here will not be decided by chance, it will be decided by me. The door opened without resistance, because by the time I reached it, there was nothing left in this building that would deny me access, and I stepped inside quietly, not out of hesitation, but out of precision, because moments like this are not rushed, they are observed, measured, understood, and the room was exactly as expected, controlled, sterile, filled with the soft hum of machines that exist only to confirm that life is still present, still holding on, and there she was, Ava Brooks. Lying still beneath the dim hospital lighting, her presence smaller than it had been just an hour ago, as if the world had tried to reduce her to something fragile, something temporary, and I stood there for a moment without moving, taking in the details, not because I needed to, but because I always do, the rise and fall of her breathing, steady but shallow, the positioning of her hands, the slight tension still visible in her expression even in unconsciousness, like her body had not fully accepted what had happened yet, and I moved closer slowly, each step deliberate, until I was standing beside her bed, close enough to see the details most people overlook, the faint crease between her brows, the subtle strength in her posture even now, and it confirmed what I had already sensed: she was not weak, she was not careless, she was decisive, and that made her different. I rested my hand lightly on the edge of the bed, not touching her, just anchoring myself in the moment, because this was not something I could delegate, not something I could reduce to a report or a result. This required presence, and I do not give that lightly, not to anyone, not ever, and yet here I was, standing in a hospital room in the middle of the night, focused entirely on someone who, by every rule I live by, should not matter, but rules exist to create order, and sometimes order shifts, sometimes it evolves, and when it does, you either adapt or you lose control, and I do not lose control. Her name was already echoing in my mind again, not as a question, not as a curiosity, but as something defined. Something fixed, Ava Brooks, and I let the silence settle around us, not empty, but heavy with everything that had already been set in motion outside this room, decisions made, actions underway, outcomes already aligning with my expectations, because that is what happens when I decide something will be handled. It is handled, completely, efficiently, without noise, without hesitation, but none of that reached into this room. None of that mattered here, because here, the variable remained, the one element I had not planned for, the one factor that had inserted itself into my world without permission, without logic, and changed the direction of everything, and I studied her for another moment, searching for something that would explain it, something that would reduce it to a pattern I could understand, but there was nothing, no calculation, no hidden motive, just a choice made in an instant. And that is what made it dangerous, because unpredictability does not belong in my world, and yet she had brought it here, and now it was mine to contain. My gaze shifted briefly to the monitors, confirming what I already knew: stable, consistent, controlled, and I allowed myself a slow breath, measured, deliberate, before looking back at her, my voice low, steady, meant for no one else but still spoken as if it carried weight. "You changed something you did not understand," I said quietly, not as blame, not as warning, but as truth, because that is what this was: a shift, a deviation. A moment that would not be undone, and as I straightened slightly, adjusting my posture, regaining the full clarity I always operate with, one conclusion settled firmly into place: she was no longer just a bystander, no longer just a name on a tag, she had become part of the equation, and once something becomes part of my equation, it does not leave until I decide it does, and I have not made that decision yet. Time moves differently in a room where nothing is supposed to change, where every second feels stretched thin between what was and what will be, and I remained exactly where I was, not because I needed to stay, but because leaving too soon would imply something unfinished, and I do not leave things unfinished, not when the outcome has not yet been fully defined. And as I stood there, the quiet rhythm of the monitors became background noise, predictable, consistent, something I could rely on, unlike the situation itself, because she was still the only variable that did not align with the structure I had built around everything else, and that demanded attention, not emotion, not distraction, just attention. Focused and deliberate, my gaze rested on her again, not searching for weakness, but for pattern, because patterns reveal intent, and intent defines action, and yet there was still nothing to extract, no indication of calculation, no trace of self-interest, just the aftermath of a decision made without hesitation, and that absence of motive made her more difficult to categorize than any opponent I had ever faced. Footsteps approached quietly from behind the door, controlled, measured, and I did not turn until the knock came, soft, respectful, the signal that information had arrived again. "Come in," I said, my voice low, unchanged, and the door opened just enough for one of my men to step inside, stopping at a distance that respected the boundary of the moment without needing to be told. "Everything has been addressed," he said, and I held his gaze for a second, long enough to confirm what those words actually meant, not the surface explanation, but the depth behind it, the completion, the finality, and I gave a slight nod, because that was expected, because that is what happens when I give an order. Outcomes are not left uncertain, they are concluded, and yet even with that resolution in place, nothing about this room changed, nothing about her situation shifted in response to that closure, which reinforced the one thing that mattered most now. This was no longer about what had already happened, it was about what came next. I turned my attention back to her, letting the silence stretch again, not uncomfortable, not empty, but filled with the weight of decisions that had not yet been spoken, because those are the decisions that define everything, not the ones you announce, but the ones you accept internally before anyone else is aware they exist. And I stepped closer this time, just slightly, enough to reduce the distance between us to something intentional, something chosen, and I studied her expression again, looking for any sign that she might return to awareness, any shift in the subtle tension of her features, but there was nothing yet, just stillness, controlled and temporary, and I exhaled slowly, measured. As another realization settled into place with complete clarity, she had acted without knowing who I was, without understanding the consequences, without calculating the risk, and that made her different from everyone else in my world, because everyone else either fears me, follows me, or tries to challenge me, but she had done none of those things. She had simply acted, and that simplicity carried more weight than anything else, because it meant she had not chosen me, she had chosen the moment, and that is not something I can ignore. My voice broke the silence again, quiet, steady, deliberate. "You do not belong in this world," I said, not as a rejection, not as a dismissal, but as a fact, because this world does not reward people like her, it consumes them, reshapes them, or removes them entirely, and yet she was here now, connected to it in a way that could not be undone, and I straightened slightly, adjusting my posture as the decision finally settled, complete, irreversible, the kind that does not require repetition, does not require justification, it simply becomes reality, and once it does, everything else aligns around it. I looked at her one last time before turning toward the door, my tone unchanged but carrying a finality that needed no emphasis. "That changes tonight," I said, and with that, the direction was set, not by chance, not by circumstance, but by choice, my choice. Decisions, once made, do not wait for permission to unfold, they begin immediately, quietly at first, then with a momentum that cannot be reversed, and as I stepped out of the room, the corridor no longer felt like a place of uncertainty, it felt aligned, structured around a direction that had already been set, and people sensed it without understanding it, the way they moved, the way they avoided direct eye contact, the subtle awareness that something had shifted beyond their control, and I walked through it without hesitation, because hesitation creates doubt, and doubt weakens outcomes, and I do not allow either to exist in my presence. By the time I reached the end of the hall, everything that needed to be prepared was already in motion, arrangements made, layers of security adjusted, information contained. Because this was no longer just about a single event, it was about containment, protection, and control of a variable that had entered my world without structure, and that variable now required structure, not optional, not delayed, but immediate. I stepped into the elevator alone, the doors closing with a soft finality that separated me from the hospital floor, and as it descended, I allowed a single moment of stillness, not to reflect, but to confirm. Because confirmation matters more than reaction, and the conclusion remained unchanged: Ava Brooks was no longer external to my world, she was inside it now. Whether she understood that or not was irrelevant. Understanding is not required for reality to exist, and when the doors opened, the atmosphere shifted again, quieter, more controlled, my environment, where decisions are executed without friction, without resistance, and the car was already waiting, engine running, door open before I reached it, and I entered without a word. Because none was needed, the city outside continued as if nothing had happened. Traffic lights cycling, people walking, conversations blending into the night, but none of it touched the direction that had already been set in motion, and as the car moved forward, I looked out briefly, not to observe the city, but to confirm distance, because distance defines control, and control defines outcome, and I reached into my jacket slowly, retrieving a small piece of information that had been placed there earlier. Her name again, Ava Brooks, along with everything else that had already been gathered in minutes, her address, her work history, fragments of a life that until tonight had been entirely separate from mine, simple, linear, predictable, and I studied it without expression, not because it interested me, but because it mattered now. Every detail matters once something becomes part of the equation, and as I read through it, one thing became increasingly clear: there was nothing extraordinary about her life, no hidden connections, no strategic value, no reason for her to intersect with someone like me, and that absence of reason only reinforced the significance of her action, because it meant it was genuine, uncalculated, and that made it rare, and rare things are not left unguarded. The car slowed slightly as we approached a controlled stop, and I closed the file with a precise motion, my mind already several steps ahead, because protection is not reactive, it is proactive, it anticipates, it eliminates uncertainty before it becomes a problem, and I spoke finally, my voice calm, even, but carrying a clarity that left no room for interpretation. From this moment forward, she is under our protection, I said, and there was no need to elaborate, no need to explain why, because the reason was already embedded in the decision itself, and silence followed, not hesitation, but acknowledgement, because everyone in my world understands that once a directive is given, it becomes absolute, and as the car continued forward, the final piece settled into place with complete certainty. She had stepped into my world without knowing it, and now my world would close around her completely, not as a threat, not as a punishment, but as a fact, because protection in my world is not something you receive, it is something that defines you once it is given. By the time the city began to quiet, the decisions made hours earlier had already taken root in ways most people would never notice, subtle adjustments, invisible shifts that redefined reality without announcement, and when I returned to the hospital, nothing looked different on the surface: the same lights, the same corridors, the same distant sounds of machines and quiet conversations, but beneath it, everything had changed. Because once a structure is placed around something, it does not need to be seen to be effective, it simply exists, and as I walked back toward her room, there was no interruption, no hesitation from anyone I passed, because the environment had already adapted, and that is what control does, it removes friction before it can form. The door to her room remained exactly where I left it, closed, silent, separating two versions of the same world, one where she was still just a waitress recovering from something she could not fully remember, and another where every variable around her had already been redefined, and I stepped inside again without a sound, the air still, unchanged. Her condition steady, the monitors confirming what had already been established, stable, consistent, controlled, and yet something was different this time, not in the room, not in the environment, but in her, because there was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, the faintest movement in her expression, like consciousness was beginning to push through the quiet, and I stopped just inside the room, watching, not moving closer yet, because timing matters, and awareness is a threshold that cannot be rushed. Seconds passed, slow, deliberate, until her fingers moved slightly against the fabric beneath them, a small motion, but enough to confirm it. She was coming back, and I stepped forward then, closing the distance with the same measured precision, my gaze fixed on her as her breathing adjusted, becoming more aware, more connected, and then her eyes opened, slowly, unfocused at first, searching without understanding. And for a moment, she did not see me, not fully, her vision still catching up to reality, her mind still trying to assemble the pieces, and when her gaze finally settled, it held confusion, not fear, not recognition, just confusion, because to her, I was still the same man from the restaurant, nothing more, nothing defined, and that clarity, that lack of awareness, confirmed everything I had already decided. She had no idea what she had stepped into, no understanding of what now surrounded her, and I remained still, allowing her that moment, because it was the last moment she would have where nothing had meaning beyond what she could see. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, unsteady, but present. "What happened?" she asked, the question simple, direct. Completely disconnected from the reality that now existed beyond those words, and I held her gaze for a second, just long enough to measure the distance between what she knew and what was true, and I answered calmly, evenly, without revealing anything more than necessary. "You are safe," I said, because that was the only part that mattered for now, the only truth she needed in this moment, and she blinked slowly, processing, her expression shifting slightly as fragments of memory began to return, not complete, not clear, but enough to create questions she could not yet form, and I stepped closer to the bed, not imposing, not threatening, just present, controlled, my voice steady as I continued. "You made a choice," I said, not explaining it, not framing it, just stating it, because that is what it was, a choice, and choices define everything, even when the person making them does not understand the outcome. And her eyes searched mine again, trying to find something, context, meaning, anything that would anchor her to what was happening, but there was nothing there I had not chosen to show, and that was intentional, because understanding comes in layers, and she was only at the beginning, and as the silence settled between us, not empty but heavy with everything she did not yet know, one thing remained absolute: her life had already changed, completely, and there was no version of it that would return to what it had been before. She watched me the way people do when they are trying to understand something that does not fit into the world they know, her eyes searching for answers that were not there yet, and I let that moment exist without interruption, because forcing understanding too early only creates resistance, and resistance complicates outcomes, and I do not complicate what can be controlled. The room remained quiet except for the steady rhythm of the monitors, a reminder that time was moving forward whether she was ready or not, and she shifted slightly, testing her own awareness, grounding herself in the reality she could feel, the bed beneath her, the air in her lungs, the presence of someone she recognized but did not truly know, and that distinction mattered, because recognition creates comfort, while knowledge creates consequence, and she had only one of those right now. Her voice came again, steadier this time, still uncertain but no longer fragile. "I remember the restaurant," she said slowly, piecing together fragments, her brow tightening as memory tried to align with logic, and I watched her carefully, not reacting, not confirming, just allowing her to move through it at her own pace, because what she remembered was only the surface. And the surface is rarely where the truth exists. She inhaled quietly, her gaze lifting to meet mine again, searching for something more concrete, something that would anchor her thoughts. "You were there," she added, not a question, but not entirely certain either, and I gave a slight nod, acknowledging only what she already knew, nothing more, nothing beyond her current understanding, because information is not given freely. It is given when it serves a purpose, and right now, her purpose was to recover, to stabilize, not to comprehend the full scope of what had happened, or what it meant. The silence stretched again, not uncomfortable, but heavy with everything unspoken, and she shifted her focus slightly, taking in the room, the environment, the subtle details that did not match what she would expect from a normal situation, the absence of confusion, the absence of disorder, everything too precise, too controlled, and I could see the moment her instincts registered that difference. Even if her mind had not caught up yet, people sense structure before they understand it, and that awareness would grow, slowly, inevitably. I stepped closer again, not closing the distance completely, but enough to make my presence undeniable, my voice calm, measured, carrying the same steady tone it had since the beginning. "There are things you do not need to worry about," I said, because that was the simplest way to define what she was about to face, not as a warning, not as reassurance, but as a boundary. And she looked at me, trying to decide whether to accept that or question it, and for a moment, I saw the same determination that had brought her into this situation in the first place, the same instinct that chose action over hesitation, and that confirmed something important. She was not someone who simply accepts what she is told, she processes it, evaluates it, and that meant this would not be simple, not passive, but that did not change the outcome. it only changed the path. I held her gaze steadily, allowing that understanding to settle between us, and then I spoke again, quieter this time, but with a clarity that did not need emphasis. Your life will not return to what it was, I said, not as a threat, not as a promise, but as a fact, because that is what it was, an irreversible shift, and she did not respond immediately, her eyes searching mine again, trying to measure the weight of those words, trying to decide if they were real, if they mattered, and in that moment, she stood at the edge of something she could not yet see, something that would redefine everything she thought she understood. And I straightened slightly, my posture returning to its natural precision, because the moment had reached its conclusion, the foundation had been set, and everything that followed would build from here, and as I turned toward the door, my final thought settled into place with complete certainty. She had stepped into my world without knowing it, and now that world would shape hers completely, not by chance, not by circumstance, but by design, because once something becomes mine to protect, it also becomes mine to control, and I do not leave anything under my control unfinished.